this audience, which I could easily sit at your feet and glean lots and lots of amazing information and skills. So I am humbled to be presenting first tonight amongst giants. And I was asked to give a primer on the Salish Sea. However, I think several of you could give your own primers on the Salish Sea, but I will keep it simple nonetheless, and I will start my screen sharing. There we go. Excellent. So thank you so much, Deborah, for your kind introduction. I am coming to you from the land of the Samish Indian Nation and the Swinomish Indian tribal community. And I'm on Fidalgo Island, which is called by the settlers. It's a place that's been stewarded by these people since time immemorial, and who continue to lead those with eyes to see by example and with patience. And so for perhaps 500 generations even, the Coast Salish peoples have taught their own children about the sea, but not as a subject of study, but as one learns about their own relatives through stories. So if you'll humor me, I'll tell a couple of stories about my relatives and see what we can learn from the stories, but about the ecosystem in particular. So if you kind of hear something about the ecosystem, keep it in mind and you can share it in the chat. I'm going to try to see if I can be able to see the chat at the same time. I can. That's brilliant. Excellent. So my family goes to the mountains. And from the time of 80-pound wood frame Trapper Nelson packs and Army surplus tents made of canvas, to the advent of REI and blessed wool socks that don't itch like crazy.
It's supposed to be nice till Friday.
Oops, someone has a mute on.
Oh,
we've got days to do things.
That's okay. I'll just keep going. And if you have your mute off, go ahead and put it on. That's just fine. I'm sure they'll fix it. So yes, I think I was mentioning wool socks that feel good instead of itching like crazy. But from driving rain to mosquitoes and biting deer flies and bushwhacking through Cascade Azalea and mountain ash, dodging Devil's Club and the sleepless kind of nights, what is that noise there? They provide ample levels of discomfort, shall I say. But overcoming discomfort builds grit. And some of you likely know, backpacking in the Pacific Northwest takes grit. Adults in our family did their best to allay some of the discomfort for us kids with diversions, like, lemon drops at the top of the next rise or just around the next bend. But once the diversion came in a pile of turds on the side of the trail. And my uncle gathered us cousins around and surmised, looks like elk. Then he picked one up and said, yep, smelled like elk. Let's be sure. Then he popped it into his mouth and said, yep, definitely elk. While the turds turned out to be Milk Duds candies. That's one story. The high country locals like cutthroat trout, Canada jays, pikas, mountain goats, and marmots, they lifted our spirits too. In fact, they provided sheer joy, not to mention the Cascade blueberries when ripe. That's bordering on bliss. Somehow recalling all that joy, we'd forget the discomfort just in time to plan the next trip. And yes, I've passed that along, it seems, to the next generation who, since gear now is so clearly too light and comfy, adds climbing ropes and backcountry skis to his pack for an acceptable level of discomfort. And now to the whitecaps. So I said I'd start with the snowcaps. If I didn't, I meant to. Snowcaps to whitecaps. My propensity to study marine life was spawned on these South Sound, Puget Sound beaches, where my great-grandparents homesteaded, raising turkeys and chickens. And by the time I was on the scene, though, the house had burned down. The chicken house was turned into a cabin. Rustic is an understatement. Oh, and a legendary two-seater outhouse. Sadly, not part of this story. I'm sorry. But here was access to the beach and all the wonders of the Salish Sea. Once when we were on one of our regular walks down to the lagoon, this is the outlet you're seeing in this picture. We could see salmon swimming under the lagoon, swimming into the lagoon. There's a stream that comes into it under this little narrow bridge, which was narrower than it is in this picture, but that's the actual bridge. It's right by the Heron Island Ferry on Key Peninsula, if anybody knows where that is. So we saw salmon coming through, and before I knew it, my Aunt Marilyn had stripped down to her bra and undies, jumped into the shallow water and caught a coho salmon that swam right between her legs. Dinner. She is quite a character. She has more stories, but she says she can't release them until she's dead. But in these stories, what facts did you learn about this ecoregion that we, since 2009 in Washington and 2010 in BC, call the Salish Sea? You can go ahead and put your answers in the chat. Did you glean something about its flora, its fauna, its climate, its topography, ecology, the interdependence and meaning of all life? Okay, maybe that's asking a lot, but if you gleaned anything from the stories about the ecosystem or ecoregion, you can enter that in the chat. I was going to ask the same question that Deborah asked, if you could share your own Salish Sea story or a memory, like a favorite memory of the Salish Sea. So if that's something that you'd rather share, you can share that in the chat, or wait for the break between, like Deborah asked. She stole my thunder on that one. Nice. I see Catherine says, it fed from snowy mountain streams to the ocean shore with nutrients returning via the salmon. Nice. Oh, that was a good one. If anyone, that was before that. How old it is, generations enjoying it. It is diverse. Nice. Love that. Thank you for participating. There'll be more chances to. Encompasses mountains and ocean, land, mammals, and salmon. It's true. Yes. Don't forget the blueberries. Did I mention the pikas? That is my favorite animal. All right, let's zoom out a bit and get to the subject here. Okay, we're zooming out a lot. This is pretty far up in the atmosphere. This photo by NASA is a satellite image. And let's see, is it? Yeah, that star marks the great Aunt Marilyn salmon grab in the South Sound. So we're looking southwest toward the coast from in the mountains above the Salish Sea. And I love this image because it shows that the ecosystem is one grand estuary. From this perspective, we can't see the many challenges we read about or study, the shipping noise, the pollution, the habitat taken over by our constructed world. Another thing we can't see is any international border. And that's another great challenge imposed on wildlife and humans. And that border between the US and Canada, or the borders around every Coast Salish reservation and reserve. But we who are trying to heal the sea, this causes us some discomfort, in fact, quite a bit. Overcoming these boundaries to build initiatives or legislation to protect the water and wildlife, or even, make a decent map. That takes grit too. Luckily, as we see from the speaker lineup for this series and the audience members here, there are people already addressing these challenges and people like you joining them all the time. And your grit, frankly, gives me hope. And so I'm hoping to instill a little hope in the audience here tonight about this beautiful sea we share. So the name Salish Sea was suggested by Dr. Bert Weber at Western Washington University's College of the Environment, back then called Huxley, to call the inland sea composed of, somebody got that prize, or several people earned the prize, but earlier by saying the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Strait of Georgia, and the Puget Sound. So from Campbell River way up here, all the way down to Olympia way down here. Excuse me. is one Salish Sea. And the reason Dr. Weber was so emphatic and lobbying for this name of having the one name is so that we could in fact discuss this and consider this as one great inland sea, one ecosystem which we can heal together, to come together. It is intended, the name is intended to honor the Coast Salish speaking peoples here. Somebody I'll tell you about an octopus rescue story later if you haven't heard it already. And somebody in some of the chat about the story said, "What is this Salish Sea? Don't they mean the Puget Sound is where this is happening?" A lot of people don't yet know it. When I was with Sea Doc Society, we did a survey to find out how many people actually know the word Salish Sea, the term. And it was, I think, like 11 and 15% in Washington and BC. I think BC knew it a little bit more. So it's still a new term. And somebody answered him and said, "Oh, don't you know that Salish Sea is the old Indian way of calling the sea?" And I thought, oh my gosh, no, it's not. it was not a term. You know, there are native language names for waterways and islands and places, you know, reef netting sites and you know, camas gathering places everywhere throughout this region, but there wasn't somebody's, you know, name for the whole sea that we now call Salish Sea before that. So, yes, this image somehow makes that picturing it as one big inland sea easier. And this is again Stephen Freeland's map from Western Washington University, and it is. Gosh, one large estuary from, you know, the mountains to the sea along all 4,600 miles or 7,400 kilometers. I think we Americans are outnumbered by Canadians tonight by far of coastline. So this is our pantry. This is our climate moderator. It is our playground and it is our teacher. I'm glad to be able to call it by one name. So I mentioned folks who give me hope. A little organization that gives big reasons for hope is Sea Doc Society. This is their little office on Orcas Island in West Sound. And around 5 years back, well, there we go, there's that tagline. This guy, wildlife vet and biologist, Dr. Joe Gatos, he chose to go big or go home on the education side of Sea Doc. So along with the board member, naturalist, and author, Audrey DeLilla Benedict, both of whom have more grit than most people I know, wrote a Salish Sea story for kids called Explore the Salish Sea, a nature guide for kids. And then I came along and compiled a curriculum based on this book. By the way, we featured one of the famous filmmakers in the audience, Bob Turner's videos throughout this curriculum as well. So it's nice to have you in the audience. I'm glad you're here. The rest of my talk is that sort of a Salish Sea primer based roughly on the flow of the curriculum that I developed. So channel your inner fifth grader and let's explore. We'll begin with a whale. Wait, did I skip a slide? Oh, there we go. Welcome to the Salish Sea is the introduction. Oh, thank you. People are putting in their favorite memories. I love that. Thank you. Kayaking to hot springs, island near Tofino, my favorite hot springs ever, by the way. Excellent. So let's talk about a whale. Let's talk about whales. When my niece, we always say it's whales we're talking about. My niece was about 2. She said, "It's whales we're talking about." And ever since then, we've been quoting her because we do often talk about whales in our household. Now she's 17. This whale, Scarlet, I'm sorry to leave you on a sad picture, or J50, is a member of the J pod in the southern resident orca population. And you should not be able to see the indents here on her skull. You shouldn't be able to see the shape of her skull. She's very thin here. These are Lummi Nation leaders placing Chinook salmon in front of southern resident killer whale calf J50. And remember what I said about grit? This is Joe, about to shoot a dart of anti-parasite medicine into a moving whale from a moving boat in rough seas. And I'm wondering what these images, all three of them together, make you wonder. That's how the curriculum begins. What do you wonder? And feel free to answer that in chat. What do you wonder about those three images? The whale, the skinny whale, the Lemmy Nation feeding the skinny whale and her family, both spiritually and physically, doing feedings. That's where the journey begins. So from there, let's gather clues from the snow caps to the white caps here in our home waters to solve the mystery of what's going on with the southern resident killer whales and what they need to recover. And then we'll share our ideas at the end. So there are killer whales throughout the world ocean, and each group or ecotype is genetically, vocally, and dietarily distinct. And here in the Salish Sea, we have two of those ecotypes, usually resident and transient. Transient's also called Biggs after the pioneer Canadian killer whale biologist, Michael Biggs. Resident killer whales mainly hunt for salmon, especially Chinook salmon, but do fill in around the edges with other big fish like lingcod. There are a lot of edges to fill in recently. There are two pods of resident killer whales, northern residents and southern residents, whose territories do overlap near, funny enough, the international border. But like I said, they don't know that. The whales don't show a passport when they cross over. There is another ecotype of orca in offshore waters, cleverly called offshores, that rarely enter Salish Sea waters. From necropsies of a couple washed up, they found that their diet consists mainly of sharks. Now, sharks have sandpaper-like skin, so I'll let you guess which one of these teeth, these are castings of killer whale teeth that belong to Joe. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Which one of these belonged to the shark eater? Now, if they have sandpaper-like skin and you're munching on those your whole life, what might that do to your teeth? So that's a hint. You can also put your answers in the chat. So don't get lazy on the chat, guys. I have it right here. I can see it. Come on, work with me. And then which one of these is a mammal eater? I guess you could call these A, B, and C from left to right. And then which is the salmon eater? So if you needed to keep a slippery fish from falling out of your mouth, which teeth would you want? Yeah, I will keep, I don't know if people just stop putting things in the chat. Oh, no, they didn't. My chat was just frozen for a moment. Thank you. Smaller is the shark eater, definitely. That's right. From left to right, Lynn says mammal, salmon, shark. Absolutely. Middle hook is for the salmon. Yes, Tara or Tara. That's true. So that keeps them in. So I just love this picture. I remember when Justin at CDOC lined these up on his desk and took the photo. So I popped that right in the curriculum. There are 36, I mean, whales get all the attention, killer whales do, for good reason, but there are 36 other species of mammals in the Salish Sea, from the cuddly to the giant, to the speedy, and to the small but mighty. Oh, by the way, if you know what those are, you can put names in the chat. We'll just keep typing. Your fingers will be tired. And there are 172 bird species in the sea, in the rivers. Over and under the river, this one, I mean, nobody's typing the names of the animals, so I'm just going to say this is the American dipper. Amazing little birds that swim underwater, hold their breath for quite a long time in very fast rapids in the rivers, and pluck up little macroinvertebrates on the stones below. And during salmon spawning season, love to munch an egg or several dozen. So one of my favorite birds. And they're also on the shores, like this black oyster catcher. And there are 253 species of fish here, like these herring. They're in the rivers, lakes, and of course, these are sockeye, and in the sea. So this is, I'm giving up on you guessing species. I'm just going to tell you, this is a rockfish that reaches 95 years of age. It's a quillback rockfish. And it doesn't even reproduce in the first 10, even maybe 20 years of its life. So one thing I get to do on the side is help gather data to track rockfish population recovery indirectly for NOAA. And we count young of the year, or yoys, we fondly call them, while diving. We have a very scientific way of determining whether a rockfish is a yoy. So young of the year, remember, is a yoy, Y-O-Y. This is what we do with our fingers. Yep, it fits between the fingers, it's a yoy, and then we can mark down which kind. So it's very technical work. Back to the crazy fish down there. Some have amazing hairdos like this decorated war bonnet, or adorable faces like these wolf eels guarding eggs. You can see the egg hiding up behind there. And grabbing a snack, kind of like popcorn. I wouldn't want to eat that as popcorn, but they have very strong jaws and hard mouths. They are quite canine looking. And others have amazing camouflage. Can you even find the sculpin in this picture? All right, time's up. And there are more than 3,000 invertebrates, including the largest octopus in the world. I do have a story about rescuing one of these, but I'll save it for the end. Now for chapter 1, so that was all the introduction. Looks like juvie quillback rockfish. Yeah, that was a young one. Thank you, Marnie. And that's somebody else who recognizes rockfish. We can talk later. All right, so chapter 1, here we go. Chapter 1 has a lot to do about the Salish Sea being one part of the one world ocean and affected by the circulation of the whole ocean. The whole ocean circulates, mixes, and moves a lot. So what are some of the forces that cause all that ocean motion? If you have any ideas about that, feel free to pop those in the chat. What makes the ocean move? What makes circulation happen? Well, here's one thing. Warm water is less dense than cold water. You probably know this already. If you have dove into a pond and you get to the bottom, it's usually colder down there. Cold water sinks and warm water floats. And the same with the sea. And that causes convection current. And so you have warm water rising, especially at the equator, and cool water sinking. So that's one thing. And then salt does something to water. If you add salt to water, it adds weight, right? And there's a sequence of it dissolving, and you can see the little H2O Mickey Mouse shapes surrounding the parts of a salt, the salt compound. And so, you know, that's the takeaway from this is salt adds weight to water. So if you put salt water in fresh water, it's going to sink. And you get what's called a pycnocline. You get cold, salty water at the bottom, warm, fresh water at the top. And it can take a moment for the two kinds of water to sort themselves out by weight. So you can get a sea that looks like this, where a giant river is pouring in. Anyone recognize where that might be? If you know, you can, of course, answer in the chat. Yeah, oh, thank you, Lynn, for playing along. Wind, so uneven heating due to the axis tilt. Yes, and the sun on the equator. Wind, storms, and density. Yes, then that is the Fraser River, fresh water on the right, and salt meeting the saltier water in the Salish Sea on the left. And that beautiful shot is by Jess Newley. We'll see more of her pictures later. There we go. So this, all this ocean motion includes upwelling. So in the summer, prevailing winds are from the north, and they're pushing the surface water away from the shore. And if something's missing, there's less weight on top, then what's below is going to come up and meet it. And so you have the cold, deep, highly nutrient rich bottom water moving up in the Salish Sea to the surface. And this makes a wonderful nutrient soup in the photic zone where there's enough light for photosynthesis, which plankton need. Plankton like these diatoms and other phytoplankton like these dinoflagellates. So both of those are part of the phytoplankton or plant plankton that produce through photosynthesis over half of the oxygen we breathe, over half. So the next breath you take, hold your breath. Okay, take a breath. You can think of phytoplankton. These are Noctiluca, by the way, and those are the ones responsible for that beautiful bioluminescence, that glowing water with that when you agitate it at night in the summertime in the Salish Sea. I'm sorry if you thought that was magic and I just ruined some childhood fantasy, but it's a dinoflagellate. The upwelling deep water moving landward and that huge contribution of fresh water from the Fraser jumping in partially and the Skagit and Stillaguamish and every other ish river down to the south of the Sound, they partially cause estuarine flow. And so this diagram is showing that the salt water coming in over the Admiralty Inlet sill from the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then in through the Puget Sound, tidal mixing, and then the fresh water moving in a net movement outward. It does move back and forth, sloshing with the tides, but there's a net outward movement of the fresh water at the surface leaving. So you kind of get this circulation. I don't want to leave Canada out. So here in the Georgia Straits bathymetric cross section. So this is the south to the left by the Juan de Fuca Strait, and then northward towards Campbell River as you go right. I'm not going to quiz you on any of this diagrams, so don't worry about it. The gist is that there is this estuarine flow happening and lots of other physical parameters that are making waves and tides, of course, and once in a while even seismic events causing tidal waves, but that's another lecture. So what does all this ocean motion mean for things like, say, oil spills? This is straight from the Trans Mountain Expansion Project website, who are quite proud that they're nearing 80% construction completion as of March 10th of this year. And that means up to 35 additional oil tankers a day passing through the Salish Sea waterways. And who mines this? Besides the killer whales and everybody else who's getting quite a noisy and a dangerous waterway. But this is a map I was given permission to use by Sayout First Nation. And this is their marine use maps for first foods. So for clams, seaweeds, and oysters on the left and fishing areas on the right. And that's juxtaposed with the shipping lanes, which are light green. And so this is a big deal. This is a big challenge. This is a challenge to treaty rights, as so many actions of settler decisions are. And yet there are people doing something about this and able to at least track what would happen, including this incredible mathematician and oceanographer, Dr. Trang Kangongkar, and his team at the Salish Sea Modeling Center. And thanks to them, we can actually predict how a spill, should it happen, based on its contents, its volume, and multiple oceanographic and atmospheric conditions. We can predict where it will move, how it will circulate in the Salish Sea. He made a simplified version of this model for use by the 5th graders using our curriculum, because he's not only a genius, he's a darn nice guy. That doesn't prevent the spills, it doesn't solve it, but it's a big deal to be able to understand how things might move and have spill responses better. So the students are able to model a spill and see what happens. Of course, they are on a mission to protect the first foods in that, for Sayout, First Nation, in that activity. All right, that brings us to chapter 2. I better speed up. So chapter 2 is all about the water cycle and watersheds, and we all remember the water cycle. When precipitation happens, which it does here a lot, what doesn't percolate down into the groundwater works its way down slopes, making our enchanting streams and creeks and waterfalls and rivers and lakes and wetlands until it ends up in the sea. Now, we'd all like to think that what happens in the watershed stays in the watershed, but it just ain't so. The Salish Sea watershed drains the entire Fraser River and Skagit River basins, plus hundreds of smaller creeks and rivers, which flow through every kind of natural and built environment. And what comes off of our roads, what comes out of our lawns, what comes out of construction sites and factory outflow, and even in the air and settling down into the water, ends up in the sea. We're all uphill from the ocean. And this is a coho salmon pre-spawning that is struggling at the surface in Longfellow Creek near Seattle. And so this was a mystery that researchers were trying to determine. They realized that filtering the stormwater before it gets into the creeks actually prevented mortality events from happening with even juvenile and little fry, coho fry. Coho are more sensitive to whatever was going on than other species of salmon. But this is a big deal, so there's a mystery to solve here. Luckily, there are communities all around the sea that are doing something big to filter stormwater. We'll return to that mystery a little later on when we talk about salmon. So this is a built wetland stormwater treatment that is in Point Defiance in Tacoma, and stormwater from 600 blocks of residential area and commercial area get drained into this unit. And I actually had teachers once do a test before and after of water quality, and they found the differences that it made in the nutrient levels. At least that's what we tested before it goes into Commencement Bay. So there's hope amidst the problems. I hope that you're getting that sense. Now, thanks to the water cycle, all that water in the ocean eventually ends up in the atmosphere and precipitates, like I said frequently here. And on the mountaintops, where there are fewer air particles to collide with one another and generate heat, it is often cold enough to fall as snow, which brings us to chapter 3. Which is all about geology. And I lovingly call it the Salish Sea rocks. So snow builds up, compresses into ice. 35 additional tankers per week. Thank you, Joan. Yes. And begins to move downhill under its weight. So what you're seeing, my son took this photo, is at the very center of a large glacier, and the crevasses in between are 100 to 200 feet deep. So this is a big one. This is not here, it's in Alaska, but that's a lot of ice. And can you imagine how heavy it is against the rock beneath? Between 19,000 and 13,500 or so years ago, the planet was much cooler. This is a modern day photo here, but it may be what the area looked like during the Pleistocene Ice Age. And that is when this ice sheet cut and scoured and scored and gouged its way all the way down south of current Olympia, Washington, before it began to melt back. And on its way, Oh, by the way, at its maximum, it would have been like 5 Space Needles deep. If you are familiar with Seattle, I'm sure everybody knows the Space Needle. Up on Salt Spring Island, though, I think you would have had to add a Space Needle or two to that depth because it was deeper than Seattle. And what it scooped up as it carved, this is all ice, by the way, even though it's black, that's just the sediment scraped off the mountains as this glacier moved down through the valley. It's like a big bulldozer blade. So see all that rock and the sand and silt and glacial flour and even boulders that are picked up got carried along southward. And as the glaciers melted and retreated, of course, all that was set right down into the fjords and shorelines of the newly formed Salish Sea. As it melted back, then the Pacific Ocean could flood into those newly gouged out arms. And it created the perfect habitat for fish, like this starry flounder, who's good at having a good hiding spot. And eelgrass, therefore herring and baby salmon and Dungeness crab and on and on and on, which we'll come back to. And surf smelt. Perhaps you've seen surf smelt eggs like these on a beach near you and didn't even know it. They're about the size of like a grain of salt. Sediment is essential to these species, all of them. And when it gets washed away from the beaches by storms without new sediment coming downhill from uphill, well, you end up with just rocks on the beach and fried eggs in the summer's heat. These surf smelt eggs need to have the protection of this gravel. They can get turned over and covered up and stay cool and moist, whereas if they're stuck on a boulder or a cobble stone, then they get heated in the sun and don't live. So we need that's nourishment. So this is a before and after shot from South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group, who removed this bulkhead, where you can look at the size of these cobbles and boulders over, not boulders, sorry, but they are nearing cobble size. And then after they took the bulkhead away, they put some protection down so it wouldn't just all erode quickly. And then look at this size of sand and gravel that's there now. So perfect habitat for forage fish that require beaches for spawning. And that's important because everyone knows forage fish are like the Snickers bars of the sea. Everything eats them, the birds, the salmon, and eagles and whales and the sea lions, and it goes on and on. So we need those. So we need some natural beaches. The shade is going to help a lot too, as these trees get bigger and lean over the beach and shade it. So that is the study. That is a study and a hands-on visit to the beach that kids using the curriculum get to do. And this is happening still. This is Mount Baker. I just took these last fall on a hike. This is a moraine, which I was terrified hiking up, called Railroad Grade. And it leads right up to the base of the glacier where climbers are preparing their ascent to summit Mount Baker. And that right when I was there was a slide on this right next to a little family with a little girl, and you could see just erosion just happening right in front of your eyes. And that's getting carried down by the rivers all the way down to the sea. So that was exciting to see up close. Of course, that glacier is smaller than it's been in any time since the last glacial maximum and shrinking quickly. Let's see. That brings us to chapter 4, life at the edges. And let's dive right in. So this is very much about first foods. It's about looking at this. Sorry, this little backpack's left from the curriculum. It means let's go explore and wonder. What do you wonder about this image? What do you think these are? And actually go ahead and do this in the chat. Because I'd be curious to see if you recognize what these photos, these electron micrographs are of. And that shouldn't have to be an electron micrograph. Maybe it's a photo through a microscope. Sorry, thinking out loud. So what is the difference? Why are these round and smooth? And what's up with these things on the right? So what does that make you wonder? I'll tell you a little bit later after you've had to consider a little bit. Here's a
And
clue.
Mira, I
Yeah.
was just telling we have about 5 minutes left
Okay, perfect.
before the Q&A.
Thank you so much. That's great. So this is, Daniela says, that's one of my favorite emojis. I'll come back and let you know what that was. Clam gardens. I bet our BC neighbors know even more about these than the folks down here in the Puget Sound. But this is, I don't think I put the next, that's because I was going to show you a 30-second video clip of this. I'm doing it. Here we go. Clam gardens. What are clam gardens? Why would you need to garden clams? Let's find out. Here's the tide going up and down. And there's the optimal clam habitat on a steep beach. But if you move some cobble and boulders and build a wall along that beach, the sediment gets trapped behind it and lengthens optimal clam habitat on the beach. Which is pretty cool, and that's been happening, they've determined, for about 3,500 years or so, along, especially in the northern part of the Salish Sea. But now, recently, just last summer, by the way, there's a picture on the left of Swinomish youth from down here on Fidalgo Island, where I live, who got to go up and learn to tend an ancient clam garden in BC, right very near your island in Salt Spring, that's on Russell Island. And here on the right, the next summer got to help build the first traditional clam garden in modern day on Swinomish land. And so there are children and community members in a big boulder brigade building the first ever modern day clam garden, which is very exciting. So large bivalve affected by acidity of ocean water. Sheila tells us the truth about those oyster larvae. That's what they were. So those were oyster larvae, and one was exposed to low pH, so more acidic waters than the other, which were plump and round. So these little bivalves used to number in the millions, but settlers discovered they could feed a lot of miners during the gold rush in San Francisco, which almost wiped them out. There's lots of restoration efforts going around, and all they need is the right habitat. Don't we all need the right habitat? You know, just food, shelter, water, place for young. By the way, they need oyster shell. These are baby Olympia oysters who have settled on because of the chemical cues of existing oyster shell. And that's a safe place to grow for them. Unless the water is not quite right. And so I mentioned lower pH water. And I'm not quizzing you on this again, but the gases in the air mix with the water. And so there's CO2. If there's a lot in the air, there's not enough buffering capacity in the water to take up CO2 and turn it to other things. It gets mixed with water and turns into a weak acid. That doesn't mean our ocean is acidic, lower than pH 7 on a pH scale. That just means that it's lower pH than it was, so it's acidifying. That's what that term means. So that's, not a great thing if you're trying to make shell, because shell requires a certain pH in order to make the shell out of the calcium and the carbonate in the water instead of losing it. And so that's a problem for little shellfish. However, there is an answer. There are many answers to this problem. I'm sure we can all think of several and wish that our leaders would implement several, but there's one that's free and natural, and it's right here. And this was the topic of my master's thesis research, was studying blue carbon. So this little world of microhabitats does many things for people, this is one of my interns, getting a sediment core in the eelgrass to measure the amount of carbon. Does many things. Oh, there's a little Olympia oysters in the habitat for us. And one of those things is sequestering some carbon. In this picture, it shows that salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses, the three blue carbon ecosystems, are sequestering more carbon than our temperate and tropical and boreal forests. So we set out to determine if that is also true in the Salish Sea with eelgrass, which provides a lot of ecosystem services. I'm going to skip through a couple of these about how carbon sequestration works. You can get a hold of me another time. We'll talk for hours if you really want to know. But when the carbon gets buried, it's locked away in the sediment. What we found out, especially if there's not much oxygen, what we found out is that, oh, and even my mom got in on the gig. There's not actually a lot of carbon sequestration happening in our eelgrasses. And those numbers from the world averages were from different types of species. That eelgrass just doesn't quite do the same work. It does something though. It does, in these bays alone, take the equivalent of this many cars off the road in the amount of carbon it sequesters. So that's a big deal. And these habitats are used by lots of migratory fish. We are so close to the end, and then I'll take questions and answers. So, oh, do you see good uptake of Salish Sea knowledge in the young? Oh, good question. I'll save that for later. Chapter 6, this is super short. We know it's a noisy sea out there and people are trying to do something about it. I don't have a lot of hope to spread about this because I have come up short in trying to find if people have developed quieter ships. But in the curriculum, the students get to do that. They get to design and engineer a quieter ship. And so maybe when they join the workforce, we'll see some results from that. In chapter 7, we're on to salmon. And I know you've been waiting. This is a beautiful photo by Florian of a coho salmon. We're on the subject of coho. They discovered that the chemical in the stormwater that was causing that pre-spawning mortality was this thing in tire rubber that is intended to prevent damage from ozone. And it's called 6-PPD quinone or quinone, or however you want to say that. And it kills fish in very low concentrations. So every time we're getting in our cars, we're leaving some tire dust on the road. And then with our big rains, it gets washed right into the sea. So I'm hoping that people are doing something about that right now. If you know anything about it, I want to hear. I don't know yet. But we know that salmon habitat restoration sites are too numerous to account for, and none brings me more hope than the Elwha River. And the fact that it is now wild and free. So I think that's a good note to end on. The rest is about Salish Sea Heroes and students in particular who have done amazing work. This is the artist response team. I was telling you the leaders of the talk earlier, singing songs in Halkomelem and English about the Salish Sea and about the origin stories of the Stalo First Nation. I just love that they're up there by Chilliwack in that picture. This is the clam garden. The students are getting to work. And this is that octopus rescue, which you can now read about or watch on national news, at least in the US, because this rescue that we did last week went viral. There was a stranded giant Pacific octopus. This little girl was bringing pails of water and dumping it on the octopus until help could arrive. And some staff at Padilla Bay and I came down and moved the octopus into deep water and let it go. But it didn't let go of me. And that's all I've got. Thank you so much for paying attention.
Thank you so much, Mira. I think we could go for another hour. But unfortunately, we have to cut it short.
My name's Chris Arnett. I've lived on Salt Spring Island for about 34 years. I'm currently speaking to you from Shiahitman, better known as Walker's Hook, on the northeast side of the island in the territory of the Penelakut people, or the people of Penelakut Island. So I'm kind of honored and surprised to be the first to talk about kind of Indigenous history in your series. And I entitled my talk Origin Myths of the Salish Sea. And I'll be talking about the origin myths, but there's basically two origin myths for the Salish Sea, one indigenous and the other non-indigenous. And both are valid ways of knowing, or have their good points and not so good points. But both are ways of helping us to understand the world. And one form has dominated for a very long time in this period, and that's the indigenous origin myth of the region. But in recent years, the non-indigenous origin myths have kind of dominated, and a lot of them are scientific based and is very important, but a lot of them are evolutionary based, especially when you get into the realm of cultural science. And I'm not a natural scientist, I'm a cultural scientist. So, I'm an archaeologist, a historian. So I'm interested in that aspect of the Salish Sea and its people. So here is a photo of Point Roberts, which was known for many thousands of years as Smokwich. And it was once an island, probably up until about 5,000 years ago, as the Fraser River began to, as sediment from the Fraser River began to go into the delta, the island became attached to the mainland. But this place, 5,000 years ago, may have been the center of the Salish Sea culturally and economically. And it was also the site of many origin myths. Origin myths are spread throughout the region, the place we call the Salish Sea, and most of them are readily available to people that want to, learn about them. They're recorded in the 19th and 20th century by ethnographers from well-informed indigenous people, and they're out there, but people find it often difficult to access them. But if you know where to look, you can find them. I'm going to share some of them today, and also talk about some of the issues when it comes to interpretation of the archaeological record. For me, the origin myths of the Salish Sea, the indigenous origin myths of the Salish Sea, confirm and support a lot of the archaeological evidence. And anyway, we'll start with some of these insights. So when it comes to understanding, appreciating origin stories, you have to begin with this individual, and he has different names in different places. So I'm speaking about the Canadian side of the Salish Sea, and we're talking about Geology. And he's also known as the transformer, or the changer, and some indigenous people refer to him as God. So he's a very important being. And you can see from this slide, the name is derived from the root he, which is something sacred, and the activity marker else, doing something sacred. And he was often conceptualized as the sun, or having some solar attributes. And you can see the next quote from Mary Rice of Penelakut Island, the late Mary Rice. Well, she died quite a while ago, actually. She said, Samshathat, which is the name for the sun, came down to the world to finish things. He came looking like a man, and his name was Hales. Then the late Dr. Ellen White also wrote a book about Geels, she referred to him as the creator. She said, the ancestors call our creator Geels. Geels made things new so he could help make life easier for the people and animals he called his children. And she also saw other words incorporated into this word, like he, which means to appear suddenly before you, and hush, to make things new. That is why we called him Geels. And here's some drawings from a book produced by the Sioux Indian Band, as it was known back then in '77. Drawings by Darlene George, and it's a wonderful example of publications that are produced by First Nations, giving their stories direct to us. And here we can see her impression of Geels and the changing of the land order. So this Geels, basically, he went around and he created all of the life forms that exist today. He created biodiversity. He created everything we see: trees, plants, animals, all of the stuff that Mira was showing us. He created and transformed from human beings, or people that were originally human-like. And you can see on the left here, we have her drawing, Darlene George's drawing, the changing of land order. And Geels is usually the stories, Geels is coming along and there's somebody there planning to subvert him somehow. Like he'll come up and go, what are you doing? And you go, well, I'm making this weapon. I heard this Geels guy is coming and I don't like any change, so I'm going to kill him when he shows up. And so Geels usually says, oh, let me look at what you're making there. And he'll take the instrument from the individual and then stick it on some part of the person and transform them into the animal which they are to become. So their outer form is, the otter, or in the center, the deer, but inside they still have this common origin. Just the exterior appearance is different. And so he created all the biodiversity, all the animals and trees we see, all the insects, the birds. And he also met a lot of nasty sort of supernatural beings called Slaklakam, who preyed upon humans and used their powers destructively, and he would transform them into stone monuments. And on the right, we see Geels turning one of these people into stone. And these became permanent markers in the landscape for future generations. So the workings of Geels preserved in the landscape remind of future generations of his mighty works. Here's an example of a well-known rock off of Victoria called Saitsim. No, I can't. My name's blocked out the name. Anyway, it means the harpooner. And as the story says here, Geels, the transformer of his spirit companions, Raven and Mink, came by in his canoe, frightening away the seal the harpooner had been stalking. The harpooner rebuked him. Geels turned him to stone as he stood there poised to throw the harpoon, saying, "You'll be the boss for the seals." Now, these stories, you have to read the stories in their entirety and understand the context, but there's lots of hidden teachings, and these teachings are memorialized in the rock. So when you're going by with your grandparents, with other people, they would point to these rocks, and some were rocks, some were mountains, some were lakes, some were cliffs. They would point to these places and narrate the story. So in this way, intergenerational knowledge was transferred down through the generations. And these rocks are found in many different places. They're not really secret. They were meant to be seen and known, and they're there if you know where to find them. Some have been destroyed, but many of them are still exactly where Geels left them. And here are just some of the examples, some of the of Geels' creation. The otter, deer, and people, trees, and he also created supernatural beings that lived in the landscapes. But no matter what you are or what a thing is, they're all connected. And this was one of the main teachings of Geels, was that everything had a common origin of creation and was thus equal within this creation. He, created people, of course, and drop them down onto the landscape at different places. I hope that's what's showing up on the screen anyway. But this is a very interesting image showing the origin of the Salishan language, where it originated. And you can see it originated right in the Fraser Delta. In fact, the word Hulkamitnam, which is the name for the language spoke on the east side of Vancouver Island between Saanich Inlet and roughly Nanaimo area, is derived from a place name in the from the Fraser Delta region. But this is the ancient origin of the Salish culture. You can see the language originated here and then spread out north up to Williams Lake area and far east into Montana, Idaho, and down, of course, into Puget Sound. But not only does the Fraser River, so why is the Fraser River the origin of the culture? Well, the Salish culture would not exist without the sockeye salmon, which we see down here at the bottom of the screen. The dependable annual runs of this fish, which allowed and access to this fish, which allowed huge populations to emerge and flourish, and it was all based on a sustainable fishery that lasted for thousands of years. And on the right, you can see the images of, or an image showing the diversity of languages. There are 23 Salishan languages and you can see the different boundaries here, just in this small area. And this language is ancient. I know it's ancient because, because the people have lived here for a long time archaeologically, but the sounds, for example, the sounds that birds make or the sounds that animals make are often the names of those very animals. So a robin, a wren is tittum. It's the name, the actual sound the bird makes. Makes so much more sense to name animals after the sounds they make. But it indicates to me how ancient this language is. And here is an interesting map I pulled off of the internet, showing the extent of the Salishan language. And you can see it covers a huge area from the coast into the interior. And if you look down by the name Montana there, you can see the word Salish. And this is the origin of the words Salish. It originated in Montana amongst a people called the Salish. And Salish means the people. And the name became associated, with all of the related languages spoke down the Columbia River and to the coast. So Hales created all this diversity, and he also created all of the people that live on all of the First Nations. And you can see here in this image is the mountain Mount Prevost on Vancouver Island, but also known as Orcas. And this is a place where one of the first men was dropped from the skies to the earth. And from this place, he met other individuals who had landed in other places, their offspring. And through all these people, the First Nations of the Salish Sea gathered and multiplied. And these first people and their descendants created a lot of the customs and institutions that were crucial to the survival of the culture. And here we just have examples of some. The fish weir on the left was invented by one of the first men at Cowichan. The Lakelam, same these individuals developed the first houses on the right. Is the Stlenek, which is also known as the potlatch. It was one of the most important institutions because it dealt with the distribution of wealth. It was not right and proper that any individual would hoard things over others. And the whole idea was to, have very efficient resource gathering methods, but at the same time, there was a real emphasis on redistributing that wealth to everybody. And I was often told by elders that, you could, the richest man was the poorest, or you can tell he's a rich man because he's so poor, because these were individuals who cared more about the community and sharing the wealth and distributing it than hoarding it for themselves. The opposite is true in our culture. In our culture, it's the man who hoards the most for himself is the most revered and respected, which is all backwards and basically unsustainable. And they also, the first people introduced the institution of the Schmiedle, which is the winter dances, which are occurring now as I speak in various longhouses throughout the Salish Sea. And this is a place where people reconnect with their guardian spirits. And as one person told me, we dance who we are. Now, these origin stories, and there's many of them, and I could go into I love telling them, but there isn't enough time. But they're out there, like I said, look in books, and especially the literature that's being produced by a lot of First Nations these days. They often have great illustrative versions of their origin stories. But the thing is, the origin story was a theory that was validated by a research method, and the research method was the vision quest. And here I use the Hokkaitan word quet, and that word has to do with getting away and into the woods, into the wilderness, away from society, and finding about who you are, what your talents were, and how you could help the collective. And this is a model derived from the work of Richard Atleo, who I highly recommend anything that he writes. He's a New Channel scholar, Indigenous scholar, but his work could be applicable anywhere in this area, because a lot of the people shared a very similar and common ideology. But the Coetet is about seeking and going to the spiritual realm to get an answer that you can bring back to the physical realm. And once you go out there and find out who you are, you come back and you can use your talents to help others, be it in fishing or in basket making, whatever it was. And people kept their spiritual powers to themselves. They didn't talk about them, oh, I've got this for a spirit power, that. But people could tell at the Schmiedle, the dances, just by the way you move, they could kind of guess. But it wasn't a good idea to share your secret knowledge with anyone. You shared it through your actions. And one of the most important things in the Coast Salish culture is this concept of Shnawailt. Now, Shnawailt is a beautiful word. The ULH suffix at the end has to do with a tool. But I was told by an elder at Musqueam that this word means to put the thought in the child's head. And the thought, of course, are the cultural teachings that were portrayed in the origin stories. The origin stories always had a didactic purpose, and you had to figure it out. They're very simple stories sometimes, but they had a simple structure, but you could elaborate that structure. But the central structure had a meaning and information that was really important. So some of the aspects of the Shnawailt, what do they teach? Is that reality is one and creation is complete. And this is why so many people are interested today. And people are interested today in the West, in the white culture, in these issues, because we're beginning to realize what the First Nations have known for millennia, that creation is complete and reality is one. There's no evolutionary kind of perspective here. Life has a dark and a light aspect. Polarity is inherent and purposeful and necessitates a negotiation of opposites and making choices between opposing realities. Protocols of all life forms are based on a common origin and respect. And this was one of the teaching of Orcas. And the other notion of Schnoil is that non-physical reality is the source of physical reality and is revealed through the vision quest. The vision quest tested the validity of the origin stories, and you felt it physiologically in your body. You knew it, and so did everybody else. There was no hierarchy of knowledge within the ancient world, because everybody had the same experience and knew the same histories. Light is the source and goal of life. You know, it wasn't a perfect world. There are always individuals that, for one reason or another, were greedy, but they were, and their stories are preserved, but they always come to a bad end because light is the source and goal of life, and that it's better to give and receive. And this is the policy of the institution of the clinic, the potlatch, which was so important in maintaining the distribution of goods so that everybody had something to eat. So if you were a person, well, everybody, there was no kind of class system. There was no kind of hierarchy of beings. Everybody was Shem, like a respected person, and lived in villages of houses. And within these villages, each house was its own kind of government. There was no tribal leader. There was no, head of the village. The highest level of political allegiance among the people was the family. And the family was a self-contained political unit that may work with other families, but generally had its own teachings, its own longhouses, and its own territories where they accessed foods and other resources. So what happened in this long trajectory of time? Hunitum came, and Hunitum are non-Indigenous people, and it's an interesting word, and it comes from it's derived from the word Huni, which is arrive, get there, and Hunitum means you were there and now you're here. Other people have translated this word to me as people that arrived out of nowhere. So there's a long history, and then all of a sudden things change, and things change quite drastically and quickly because the Hunitum introduced two things, disease and commodity capitalism, which fundamentally changed a lot of Indigenous culture. So we'll start off with the epidemic actually happened before any non-Indigenous people were seen. People had dreams about it. There were prophets that warned about it. And in 1782, it finally hit this area of North America, which had remained, smallpox first appeared in North America in 1511 on the Florida coast, and slowly, inexorably made its way across the continent. Here on the left, we can see a map by the late Cole Harris, who wrote a really excellent account of this major epidemic in 1782, how it came up from the Great Basin Desert, came down the Snake River, up the Columbia River, into Puget Sound, and then petered out around Cape Mudge, Nidinat, and the Lower Fraser River. But in its wake, it left 9 out of 10 people dead. Now that's horrific, and you can begin to appreciate the impact on the culture that was here. And down here we have the words of at the base of Sonny McCalsey, a well-known Stalo historian. You start learning why it is that we don't have stories for some of these mountains that have names and represent certain things. That's a big part of our story. We lost so much of our culture and history through smallpox. Now here's a big long quote. I don't think I'll read the whole thing, but this is by Albert Wesley. I'm a historian, but I'm always curious because a lot of academic historians don't seem to recognize the validity or contributions of indigenous historians. And this is a very important text by Albert Wesley, who is from Nanaimo. And he talked about the Great Winter in his great-grandfather's time, which was probably about 1800, and how people died from numerous, how families were hit, and some of the families became nearly extinct. But the survivors rescued those who were still surviving. In fact, like babies who were found sucking their dead mother's breasts. But since these people had no parents or kinfolk, in some cases their parents weren't even known, they were called station, a word meaning low people, and not allowed to marry people of good birth. And they built small houses for themselves near the big houses that sheltered groups of closely related families. So these were the collateral damage of the smallpox epidemic of 1782. When I talked about 90% death rates, these might have been variable between communities, but some communities were wiped out. Others, because of their kinship with all things, would bring in the people, but they slowly became this other group of a class of people. And it became exacerbated because with the arrival of increasing numbers of non-Indigenous people who were from slave trading European states. Now, David Lutz was a well-known Saanich elder, and he described a lot of the stories of Geology and the first people, and he made this little addendum to in an interview he gave with an anthropologist in the 30s, talking, which gives us a kind of an insight into this history. Because naturally, all the descendants of these people were Shem or nobles. Everybody was. And then this. But when the Indians began to war with one another and capture slaves, some married the slaves and gave rise to commoners. And you can see on the right some warfare, a village being attacked on Juan de Fuca. And on the bottom, you can see you can see Fort Victoria and a group of canoes in the foreground of Songhees warriors returning to the village, waving severed heads. And you can see they're using they're traveling in Haida-style canoes, war canoes. But anyway, so when anthropologists began to look at the Coast Salish people of the 19th century, they could see this sort of model on the left, we have on the left. But the model that Lutz talks about and all the others is on the right. We have Geels, the creation of Shem, the noble families, then the Great Winter, which creates the station, and then the introduction of commodity slavery, which began an increase in warfare because men began to leave their traditional pursuits. Things like sea otters that used to be considered a relative became a commodity that you would kill in great numbers to exchange for various goods. On the interior, it was the beaver. The beaver used to be a relative, then it became a commodity and was hunted everywhere. And the word for beaver, it actually became a word for money. Anyway, there was an increase in warfare as people began to appropriate a lot of European values that included, unfortunately, slavery and capitalism. And so anthropologists in the early 20th century and mid 20th century looked at this 19th century pattern and came up with this class system that we see on the left, with leaders at the top, Shem, then worthless people, and then a subclass of slaves at the bottom. And so you'll often hear people talking about this class system in the Coast Salish culture, but I believe that it was an institution that was introduced as the people adapted, or I would say in some cases appropriated European values in order to survive in the New World Order. And this happened worldwide, where people had to make, these choices. Now, in archaeology, archaeology goes back here, maybe back 11,000 years, or even going back even further. But people have lived here for a long time, and we have archaeological evidence over this long period of time. But archaeologists have taken this 19th century model of Coast Salish culture and used it to interpret the past. And they look at this development over time as an evolutionary development that created a rank or class society. And here they say that the development of rank or class societies involves more than simple environmental determinism and must include the interaction of resources, resource technology, and social structure, and likely involve coercion and violence. So they're assuming these things that were actually contrary to the traditional teachings of the origin stories. Here we have a chronology based on radiocarbon dates and archaeological investigations over the last 15,000 years or so in this area of BC, and long sustainable development, but around this time period, 200, things change drastically. So archaeologists look at features like these, which is a large earthen earthwork. It looks like a big giant trench, big huge ditch. And you find these throughout the Salish Sea, or at least in the northern part. And they're often interpreted as forts because they look like forts. But the only archaeological investigation, or there were two archaeological investigations of these places, found no evidence of palisades or any kind of military use of these things. And but there was one early report, it was done by a woman actually, in the 1960s, and it was much overlooked, and I have a feeling it was overlooked because she was a woman. But she argued that these were food production sites, basically giant smoking platforms. And when you look at their distribution through the Salish Sea, you find them on high ground, and they built these long trenches so that they could have fires, and then they built huge superstructure frameworks where they smoked the sockeye salmon, which was caught by the thousands in the very important and lucrative, well, not lucrative, important and productive reef net fishery and of the sockeye. And you often find these so-called forts in the vicinity of reef net locations. So, and it's interesting, some archaeologists have looked at this, the patterning of these places, because these were constructed over about a 2,000-year period, and they argue that this shows this 2,000 long period of warfare. You know, these people were building these forts and fighting each other, and this interpretation is so contrary to the origin stories that talked about you know, the relationships of everything being connected and interconnected, and everything having a common origin. But more work needs to be done on the earth bank and earth embankments. So when I look at these so-called middens, and here's an example of one on Salt Spring Island at Fulford Harbor. It's about 3, maybe 4 meters deep. And as you look at it, you can see the layers down at the very bottom there, on the bottom layer. At the earliest stage of the formation, you can see the remains of a large, very large oven of large black stones. And these stones still had a greasy texture to them. And these are probably large roasting ovens for sea mammals. And they still bear the grease of the animals that were cooked on them. But over time, as people visited the site, over time, the activities changed, and it turned, you know, there were more shellfish processing. There's some deposition from a sloping bank there. But over time, you get the same consistent patterns of resource use, of processing shellfish, building up over time. When I look at these deep middens, I see an example of sustainability. I don't see, I mean, that's what I see. I see a system that was in place based on, the origin stories and the teachings. And of course, it wasn't all la-di-da. There were a lot of rules, and penalties. For example, people that trespassed on someone else's food gathering area could be killed. And, it seems like really harsh. And some people, well, that's barbaric. But you see, no one ever did it. Because anyone who would do something like that, well, they probably say you deserve to die. But there were, strict rules, to support and maintain this system. And it was a constant struggle. So the indigenous or the Ho'okamitnam word for midden, I love this word, Arnett. Arnett is, Arnett means ground, and there's an infix in there, that L. Arnett means a covered ground, but it has the meaning also of an ancient place and a burial place, because often humans remains are found in these Arnett, as well as other things. Here's another example from an excavation I participated in Ganges Harbor on Salt Spring Island. And we got radiocarbon dates from the deepest levels of this particular portion of the midden, going back to, you can see 369, 70, about 2,000 years ago. And then over time, for the next 500 years, there was sort of, it just looked like a resource sort of processing area, just sort of a mixture of clams and stuff and shell and nothing, just, food processing. And then there was a huge fire about 400 AD. And then after that, you get these huge, or these compact levels of house floors going up to 1694. Then after that, things get a little looser. And then 1859 is when the first non-Indigenous settler came to Salt Spring Island. And after that, the people kept coming here for a number of years, but eventually a non-Indigenous settlement took over, and people were prevented from accessing their traditional food gathering areas. So after that, you can see here, just in this little snippet, 2,000 years, sustainable use, and then it's over in 1870s or so. So what we have here today are, we have two cultures and two worldviews, and we've got two diagrams that kind of give an idea of what they're about. On the left is the indigenous view of the world, which is basically a unified existence, but with a spiritual and a physical component. The two are inextricably related, and a lot of the spiritual aspects were embedded in the origin stories and the vision quest, which was validated those origin stories. So it took that experience into the body physiologically and allowed the people to carry it out in the physical world for the social reproduction of the culture to continue for thousands of years. On the right, we have a classic sort of non-Indigenous view of the world. And you can see people and environment are separated. The natural world and the supernatural world are separated. In the non-Indigenous world, the past is separate from the present and the future. Whereas in the Indigenous world, all of these things are combined together. So this is why, to me, things like, origin stories are so important. They still exist. They predate non-Indigenous ways of knowing. And they are preserved in the landscape in the form of place names and physical features. And a lot of it's been recorded, a lot of it's still known by First Nations people. And I think it's something that we can begin to relearn and rediscover and incorporate into our world today. but it's how can we do it? So that's the question. But knowing that there are methods and patterns that have been sustainable for thousands of years, I think should give us some encouragement. So I think that's my last slide.
Thank you. Thank
Was
you
that
very
up in the whole
much.
time, that thing?
That, what thing?
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all good. That's just fascinating. Very, very fascinating.
I mean,
Thank you so much.
A complicated subject and a long learning curve. So
It
I encourage
is.
people to do it because
I agree. Yeah. Otherwise, where are we going?
exactly. And if I'll share another thing, I was lucky I taught for a year at Malaspina University College with Dr. Richard Atleo. We taught in the same class, and he taught me something very interesting about understanding the past, the present, and the future. He said there's three things that you can use to solve any problem. I mean, to know what is, you have to know what was. So what is today? I mean, people are starting to discover like pollution, all the interconnections. Mira showed things about that rubber substance that's impacting fish. We have to know. So that's what is. So, but to know what is, we have to know what was. And when it comes to the culture, very few people know what was. History in British Columbia, I'd say 98% of British Columbians have no clue about what was. So if we don't know what was, how can we understand what is? And if we don't know what was and what is, we'll never understand what is possible. So we have to know all those things to solve any kind of problems.